So to set the scene slightly for Back to Black, as we've kind of discussed, around, Amy had released Frank. She was nominated for the Mercury Prize. She was seen as this really talented, authentic jazz singer with a huge amount of buzz around her. She wasn't mainstream by any means, but she was, fair to say, a recipient of a good deal of critical acclaim. So these 3 years between Frank and Back to Black is where she started to become involved in the indie scene that was burgeoning in Camden. So obviously for me and you, Ollie, looking back at Camden, it's hard to think of it as being anything but thoroughly uncool. But it was...
Yeah, it's kind of hilarious that it was seen as the centre of this thriving music scene.
Yeah, because that's the thing, it was the centre. Like, we were talking earlier about bands like the Fratellis and Razorlight and stuff. Camden was the centre of the music world for a while, and the epicentre of that specifically within Camden was a pub called the Hawley Arms, if you know it. It's a pub.
No, I think I've heard her mention it, to be fair. I think I've heard her mention it.
So it's a pub just off Camden High Street. It's up towards the Chalk Farm side of Camden. So this is a pub where Liam Gallagher, Kate Moss, Pete Doherty, Noel Fielding all drank. At one point, the Razorlight frontman would come down, and because his girlfriend at the time was Kirsten Dunst, she would be there drinking as well. It seems absolutely ridiculous, but there were tabloid gossip pages and magazines that would report on things like, oh wow, Alex Turner and Kaiser Chiefs were having a drink in the Hawley Arms the other day, which is obscene, but
Yeah, everyone wants to know what Ricky Wilson's up to.
Exactly, yeah. But apparently there was a real family feel to the place. You'd walk in, the Mighty Boosh would be in one corner, a Libertine or two at the bar, Amy Winehouse would be pulling pints. Whatever. But anyway, so in the 80s and 90s, this pub was a biker's bar, famous for not much else besides the fact there was lots of speed being dealt there. But importantly for this story, the new owners in the 2000s installed a jukebox, and in that jukebox, it was basically full of classic soul, rhythm and blues, funk, and 60s kind of girl group pop, which is where Amy came in. So she would go to this pub loads along with the people I've mentioned. She'd occasionally, as I said, get behind the bar and pull pints. She'd play pool, she'd listen to music, and all this time the music was playing bands like the Shangri-las, the Velvets, the Ronettes, and she would obviously get drunk, and this music would, I suppose, seep into her and begin to make her feel inspired. It's also important to mention that at this time she met Blake Fielder Civil, and that's where that tortured and drug-fueled romance started. So Back to Black ended up being composed of two major inspirations. One of her premature endings with Blake, and the other one being the music that she was listening to in this pub when she was playing pool. So, Ollie, my question is, obviously this album has the crusty fingerprints of Camden all over it. So having heard that story, can you kind of hear that in her sound? And these days when you walk around Camden, do you ever feel particularly inspired or not?
I mean, talking about Camden, I can't say I've been there for a while. My main memories of it are just like little tragic kind of vintage shops that are all just selling kind of bright neon clothes. So I'm probably not the best person to speak about that.
Little mini pipes and stuff like that, yeah.
Yeah, things like that. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the music, you can definitely hear the influence of the type of groups that you were talking about. Because I think Frank, her debut, that can be kind of hard to pinpoint exactly what it is. Like, is it a jazz album? Is it a hip hop album? There's acoustic moments on it as well. Yeah. But then with Back to Black, I don't think that's the case at all. It's basically what you are saying, jukebox pop, like very 60s kind of heartbreak sound. And yeah, I think a lot of that is undeniably down to the influence of Mark Ronson on this album. So like, obviously this is the record that he kind of made his name on. I feel as though everybody now knows who Mark Ronson is. He's a superstar worldwide producer, but it needs to be said that when he was working with Amy on this album, that was not the case. He was pretty much an unknown over in the UK. He was a celebrated and respected underground hip hop DJ in New York, but he was only just kind of getting started on production. Yeah. And she definitely took a chance on him. And apparently, yeah, she went out to see him in Brooklyn, told him about the kind of album that she wanted to make, influenced by those groups that you just said, and they kind of just went from there. Apparently, he went home that night, wrote the piano chords to the song Back to Black, came back in the next day, and they just went from there. And just wrote half the album in the space of 4 or 5 days, which was pretty crazy.
Yeah, that's astonishing.
I can't remember if you mentioned, but she was definitely a jazz purist. She was always about live instrumentation and things of that nature. So it was a masterstroke from Ronson to get the Dap Kings involved, who were basically just like a local funk and soul band. And they gave the album that kind of Motown edge that she was after. Yeah, so they played on most of the songs on the record, and they were also her backing band when she came to tour around the US. But I just find it crazy that they made all this music in the space of 4 or 5 days, when you think that between Frank and this album there was something like 3 years. Like what a flurry of creativity.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I guess it was all being stored up in these these lock-ins at the Hawley Arms, and and all that music and energy and the heartbreak with Blake is all fed into this album. And I think the intensity of this album is definitely reflected in that. You can almost tell, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, that these were like songs written in like a couple of weeks in this particular time, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say it's a breakneck record, because that kind of implies that it's rushed. But the whole thing is under 35 minutes. Like the longest song is 4 minutes 17 seconds or something, which is really, really concise.
I mean,
and I think
especially compared with Frank, right? Because Frank is about 55 minutes long, something like that. It's quite a meandering.
It's a lot more meandering.
Yeah, it's like a jazz. It's basically like a meandering jazz record, and this is super taut compared to that.
Yeah, I mean, the other producer on the record who we should definitely give a shout out to was Salaam Remi, who was the guy that produced the majority of Frank. And nowadays he probably isn't as big a name as Ronson, but this guy definitely deserves the utmost respect. He's worked with a lot of really incredible musicians in America, the likes of Nas and the Fugees. And I also read the other day that he produced the Miss Dynamite debut album, which I think is a masterpiece.
Yeah.
And I mean, his contributions are definitely like slightly different to Ronson's, but I still think they fall into that 60s girl group vibe she was after, like, definitely.
Yeah.
And he was based in Miami, so the whole album was basically written in Miami and New York over a few days.